So let's talk about crime. There seems to be a raging debate online. I think a lot of people talking past each other where, you look at one side and they say that everything is fine. The UK has never been better, never been safer. London, in particular, is thriving. And on the other side, we've sort of descended into a kind of dystopian hellhole where you can't leave your house without being attacked or mugged. Claire, I mean, what do you make of this discussion? I mean, there are some trends that you can pick out in some ways. It's true that homicide has gone down in the past year and gone down over the past 10 years. But clearly there are other crimes like shoplifting that are soaring and reaching record heights. Do you think it's the sort of visible stuff that people are seeing? Things like shoplifting, things that force us to change our habits are really sticking in the craw and making people angry?
Look, it's perfectly reasonable for Fraser Nelson to point out crime statistics and to say, I'm going to bring a bit of factual information to this debate. This is what he did when he wrote his big essay that caused quite a furore in the Times at the weekend, and to say crime is actually not getting worse. But for him then to say, I would argue, which he did on the radio, to say it's never been, a better time to be alive. This is just a kind of made up populist kind of hyperbole, means that he just doesn't get out enough. The truth of the matter is that what people's reactions to this is not that there's people being murdered on every street corner, but that we live in a period of intense incivility, if you want. So the reason why Robert Jenrick's, gonzo journalism, when he went around the tube stations and so on, actually had some impact and went viral, millions and millions of people watching it, and said, yes, it drives me mad too, is because anyone who lives in London has gone to the tube station and been pushed past by a group of lads who push their way through. And you do feel a bit of a mug as you kind of like pay your money for your Oyster card, right? You think, what's that about? You go into the local Tesco or Aldi or whatever, and there are people just openly filling carrier bags and walking out. And you kind of you're standing in the queue to pay, and then you kind of go into the security guard. Have you seen that? And they're kind of going, what can we do, mate? What can we do? So and that doesn't happen all the time, but it happens relatively regularly, I'm afraid to say, in Wood Green, where I'm from. You see it, and you just have this sense that there's that people in authority have thrown their hands up in the air and said, what can we do about it? At the same time that we're all furious that the police are spending their time either, wandering around trying to catch people for pre-crimes by going out jogging and saying, will somebody wolf whistle or catcall these police officers, or trying to prison people for posts they've put online. You just think, God, there are real crimes going on. Could you solve them? But, it's all that kind of... So I think it's at the level of, bikes being smashed up, people feeling that there's no respect, in a way, for law, for rules, that gives the sort of sense of things being out of control. So I don't think that wouldn't necessarily, getting irritated by the fact that people won't put their headphones on the top of the bus and play their music loudly isn't a crime, but it does have an impact on people's perceived notion of what it's like to live somewhere where you just think, God, nobody will... Can't you show a bit of respect, is what they want to say. And so I think all of those people who try and pretend that this is not an issue are not noticing just that the quality of life, due to a sort of growth of an antisocial atmosphere of disrespect for other people and other fellow citizens, and criminality that's not been dealt with, does erode a sort of sense of social solidarity in a really pernicious way, and makes people feel insecure.
Yeah. Yeah, you do sometimes feel like I'm playing by the rules a lot of the time. I actually saw 3 shoplifting incidents in one day in London. And I know that's a bit of a black swan event, that the odds of that are pretty low, but I just can't imagine that 10 years ago.
No, and the kind of phone snatching has become such a, if it hasn't happened to you, you've seen it happen, or it's happened to your friends if you live in London. There is just clear-cut areas in which crime has either been going up, and you can tell people that if you look at it on net, it's not as bad as you think. It's still going up on average, first of all, although it seemingly a large part of that is a huge uptick in fraud, as I understand it.
31% increase in fraud over the past year. I don't know what that's about, but that is a crime and it is going up.
Absolutely. And, it doesn't do to sort of say, well, it doesn't end the argument to say, well, murders are on the decline. There's obviously areas in which it has been going up. And also I think another key area is that people feel like there is no consequence when crimes are committed, or even when the kind of more low level, without using too loaded a phrase, kind of antisocial behaviour that we've been talking about is committed. It seems like the police are increasingly incapable of dealing with, say, the phone snatching gangs, that they kind of roll over, that, even if you report a burglary, that's primarily to get a crime number so that you can claim on your insurance. There's not really any assumption that there'll be any genuine investigation. And then also as individuals, less on the crime side, although to a certain extent, but more on the, the just general sort of degradation of courtesy and the public realm that has developed in places like London. Individuals feel increasingly incapable of dealing with that themselves for all kinds of reasons that have been set in train for many years. This more kind of individuated sort of society in which we live, in which people feel increasingly disempowered to try to deal with in the moment things that are irritating or potentially dangerous, not least because I think it's bred of a sense that other people won't back them up. So all of these things taken together, it's going to grate when you hear a kind of slightly more Panglossian intake. You don't have to indulge the slightly more kind of doomerist, London's a complete hellhole, it's kind of irretrievable at this point, which is often kind of, if nothing else, kind of ignorant to the times, other quite difficult times in London's recent history, shall we say, in which a lot of people were leaving as a consequence of a lot of those things. But you don't have to indulge all of that to recognise that some of this is a problem. And on this issue, as in so many others, people feel like they're being gaslit rather than taken seriously. Yeah.
And Tom, before we move on, we should talk very briefly about the case that sort of sums up the warped priorities of the police. A man in Wrexham put a sign in his window saying, that apologising to customers because they've got to put all of these, more valuable, or actually not so valuable items behind security boxes. And he said on the sign, it's because of the scumbags who are shoplifting all the time. And the police paid him a visit, not to help him out with his shoplifting problem, but to chastise him, to tell him that the sign was offensive and potentially provocative. Offensive, presumably, to the shoplifting community.
Yeah, the scumbag community might have been up in arms and protested. This is such a great example of the warped priorities of the police, isn't it? It's not even treating the symptoms rather than the cause. It's victim blaming. It's telling people off for what they say rather than trying to arrest people for the crimes that they've committed. It sounds like the kind of story that we made up just to have something to talk about. So comical is it? There was another story, wasn't there? I can't remember exactly where it was, where shops were being warned that kind of practice you see from time to time when they put up pictures, kind of CCTV pictures of people who had stolen from them, or given them a dodgy £10 note or whatever it might be. That might also be legally questionable. I don't know if that's under GDPR or something like that.
Yeah, it came from the Information Commissioner's Office. So it's against GDPR rules to name and shame burglars.
Exactly. So we're not going to investigate the burglaries. We're going to allow shoplifting to become essentially decriminalised. But if you dare call them scumbags or try to name and shame them, we will come down on you like a ton of bricks. If that's not, law and order in this country right now, I don't know what else is.
I've got just a couple of caveats, I suppose. Or one thing is, it's a genuine dilemma about whether one intervenes or not. On the one hand, you feel that you might, people will say, my mate intervened and got stabbed, or so you're a bit scared of that. But I do think we had this extraordinary experience the other day of people on the tube who intervened when somebody undressed themselves and was stark naked, and who was obviously very ill, a mentally ill lad did that. But nonetheless, it was very scary for people because, the people who intervened, I think, were arrested by the police. I'm not sure what's happened to them legally, but the fact that they were seen as the problem maybe is in of itself a problem in terms of ordinary citizens acting responsibly. The state doesn't know who the problem is a lot of the time. That's the thing. And so when you hear about people in Bournemouth saying they're going to set up these, squads of people, vigilante squads in a way, kind of go around to check on the Bournemouth beaches and so on for antisocial behaviour and criminality, I kind of want to cheer it on. On the other hand, I have to say that I slightly did balk at some of the rhetoric that came out of Reform's press conference the other day and subsequent interviews with people like Richard Tyson, which was, we men need to step up and protect our women and children. And I suddenly thought, oh God, found myself back in some Victorian novel, right? I mean, I do understand that with things like the hotels, and there is concern, and as we've seen, about women being potentially assaulted or children being the victims and so on and so forth, that there is an issue there. But I also don't want to get into a situation where we are so frightened that we posit ourselves as women, by the way, as perpetually the victims who need to be looked after and protected. That slightly irritates me as well, because it's a bit like a kind of alt-right feminism version of things, which is that all women need looking after, and we're the weaker version, and you know, all men are potential problems. And obviously there's always a smidgen of truth to these things, but women fought long and hard in order to be not treated as the weaker sex. And so I think we need to get balance here. It's just that I don't think that those liberal commentators who've said that this is all populist doom mongering are motivated by that at all. For them, when they're Panglossian, the truth of the matter is that there is now a situation where there's almost like two Englands. They're just two different. I mean, talk about parallel lives. They don't understand what most people's lives are like, and they kind of sit being rather snooty about people's fears and concerns. On the other hand, we should also make sure that we don't become hysterical ourselves. So I suppose there's something like a balance required.